I guess everyone's had an experience when they felt overlooked, ditched, hurt or taken for granted, where they felt like the only one behaving with common sense but still got the short end of the stick. We all feel like the odd one out at some point. The media tends to portray the teenage world as one where drinking and sex is taken for granted. In fact, I think most teenagers don't drink, are unsure of themselves, and feel awkward around members of the opposite sex. Being born and raised as a Californian, I somewhat ignorantly had taken for granted the diversity and liberal mindset that shaped my childhood and adult life. I think nothing can be taken for granted, be it the fact that you get to work with a certain kind of talent, certain kinds of budgets, or that the audience looks forward to your work. Well, one thing, you got to stand in a courtroom and listen to a judge sentencing you to 25 years in prison before you realize that freedom of expression can no longer be taken for granted. I totally commit and completely give myself to a relationship. Be warned, though, I don't like being taken for granted, so I can be pretty high maintenance sometimes. The principal achievement of Europe is peace, which we often forget about as it has become so taken for granted by Europeans. It may be taken for granted that, rash as Americans usually are, when they are prudent, there is good reason for it. Fresh, clean water cannot be taken for granted, and it is not. Water is political and litigious. Transporting water is impractical for both political and physical reasons, so buying up water rights did not make a lot of sense to me, unless I was pursuing a greater fool theory of investment, which was not my intention. I now know that things I always thought I could depend on can crash in an instant. Because of the love that I have been shown, I now know what it means to be beloved. I now know that no breath is to be taken for granted. Father was the eldest son and the heir apparent, and he set the standard for being a Rockefeller very high, so every achievement was taken for granted and perfection was the norm. The long view of the Census Bureau allows some changes that are taken for granted to be studied in more detail. Everyone knows, for example, that people get married later than they used to. In life, so many things are taken for granted, but one thing I can honestly say is that I took every day, enjoyed the game of putting on that uniform and playing the great game of baseball. Periods of cooperation between political parties shouldn't be taken for granted, they are a stunning human achievement. I read things like theology, and I read about science, Scientific American and publications like that, because they stimulate again and again my sense of the almost arbitrary givenness of experience, the fact that nothing can be taken for granted. Air superiority, which the United States has taken for granted since World War II, is no longer assured. And, without control of the skies, U.S. ships and soldiers would be vulnerable in ways that are difficult to imagine. Franklin D. Roosevelt was fortunate. He didn't take office until nearly 4 years after the Wall Street crash, by which time the Republicans' responsibility for the Depression was taken for granted. I lived in a world where social arrangements were taken for granted and assumed to be timeless. A child's obligation was to learn these usages, not to question them. The complexities of racial deportment were of a piece with learning manners and etiquette more generally. It was taken for granted that we had to make something of ourselves. Not much was said about it, it was just in the atmosphere of the home. The popular will cannot be taken for granted, it must be created. Injuries give you perspective. They teach you to cherish the moments that I might have taken for granted before. Confidence is sky high, but we're also all very grounded. We know, in football, nothing can be taken for granted. In England, unless I am mistaken, I think some of the politicians who love classical music and opera are a bit loath to be seen there in case people think it is elitist. That is a real shame because it also means we are not allowing our politicians a hinterland that an earlier generation, a Dennis Healy, would have taken for granted. The way I love monsters is a Mexican way of loving monsters, which is that I am not judgmental. The Anglo way of seeing things is that monsters are exceptional and bad, and people are good. But in my movies, creatures are taken for granted. I don't like being taken for granted anywhere in life. I don't want my vote taken for granted. It's now taken for granted that women are in bands and you can say feminist things in your songs. But back in the early 90s, there was a lot of violence at Bikini Kill shows that people don't realize happen. I want justice to be so pervasive that it will be taken for granted, just as injustice is taken for granted today. Nothing should be taken for granted, even if everybody believes it. Education is taken for granted. Teaching shops are different from building character. I'm thankful for my family's health, that everybody's healthy. That's something that can be taken for granted, so I'm grateful for that. Some sectors have a monopoly position, and football certainly does. If I am dissatisfied with my football club's facilities or the players on the pitch, I'm not about to go and purchase my season ticket from the club down the road. That loyalty should be treasured and not taken for granted. Our democracy is not something to be taken for granted. You have to fight for it. You have to commit yourself to working for it, for the long haul. For as long as anyone can remember, reliable, cheap electricity has been taken for granted in the United States. Good habits, which bring our lower passions and appetites under automatic control, leave our natures free to explore the larger experiences of life. Too many of us divide and dissipate our energies in debating actions which should be taken for granted. One of the things I find depressing about some of the upper echelons of Anglicanism on both sides of the Atlantic is that it's sort of taken for granted that we all basically know what's in the Bible, and so we just glance at a few verses for devotional purposes and then get on to the real business. As trust in institutions erodes, the basic assumptions of fairness, shared values, and equal opportunity traditionally upheld by the system are no longer taken for granted. I still make sure to go, at least once every year, to a country where things cannot be taken for granted, and where there is either too much law and order or too little. New York City should and must embrace crypto if it is to remain the financial capital of the world. We no longer live in a world where our central place in finance can be taken for granted. My years with failing vision have prompted me to learn about the nature of the eye and the incredible gift of sight, which I had always taken for granted until it began to slip away. The horrors of the Second World War, the chilling winds of the Cold War and the crushing weight of the Iron Curtain are little more than fading memories. Ideals that once commanded great loyalty are now taken for granted. Patriotism is strong nationalistic feeling for a country whose borders and whose legitimacy and whose ethnic composition is taken for granted. Teaching is good for me. It forces me to articulate ways of doing things or rules of thumb that I've sort of taken for granted. I have not been that wise. Health I have taken for granted. Love I have demanded, perhaps too much and too often. As for money, I have only realized its true worth when I didn't have it. I love trade magazines, any trades magazine. By entering into what is taken for granted in a world not your own, you better recognize the vastness of the social universe, for there are so many worlds that are not your own. Once upon a time, soft toys were for babies. Now they're taken for granted as a feature of adult life. Yet food is something that is taken for granted by most world leaders despite the fact that more than half of the population of the world is hungry. It is to the advantage of Hispanics not to be taken for granted by one party and ignored by the other. Hispanics will realize their political power only if courted and engaged by both sides. Not only are police officers often taken for granted, many people are highly vocal about their dislike for cops. We don't really make bad records, though some people might like some more than others, and we have never really done a bad show, so I think in a way maybe we've been taken for granted. A time is marked not so much by ideas that are argued about as by ideas that are taken for granted. The character of an era hangs upon what needs no defense. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.